Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm Dane, your host. Hope you're doing great wherever you may find yourselves. Blessings to all of you wonderful people out there. Today's video I think is a doozy. Today I'm going to discuss with you what I think to be the top 15 most important proto-metal bands of all time. There are a lot of proto-metal bands out there, the obscure, the quasi or semi-obscure, the lesser well-known, that sort of thing. This is not the video I'm making today. If you're interested in bands like Hard Stuff, once known as Bullet, Medusa, Dust, Sir Lord, Baltimore, Weeds, Head Machine, The Gods with a Z, The Gods with an S, all of those, Iron Claw, all those, that may be a video down the road, but I'm going to talk about mostly, I think, the well-known proto-metal bands and why they are the most important top 15. So let's get started. The exception to that may be my first one, because I think this one is going to be highly controversial among y'all, and that is the Sonics from 1965 with their first album, Here Are the Sonics, again, 1965. You have the hit Strychnine. This is a garage band from the United States, but I will argue, as I will in a second, that this is definitely proto-metal in so many facets. But let's go back to someone else's argument coming from the book called Everyone Loves Our Town, An Oral History of Grunge by Mark Yarm. Not Mark Arn from Mudhoney / Green River, but Yarm, Y-A-R-M. And in his introduction to the oral history of grunge, he argues that the Sonics were so instrumental and inspiring and influencing upon the grunge Seattle movement in the late 80s, early 90s with Nirvana, etc., the big four, right, and beyond that. And I totally agree with that. It's been a while since I read this, probably 2016, 2017, when my brother-in-law, when I was visiting him and my sister for Christmas, said, hey, man, you got to read this, and I read it in like 2 days. It's a great book. I think it's still in print, but his argument to me is solid. He argues that they are definitely a grunge band. Arguably, he argues, the first grunge band of all time. I get that. I'm going to argue they're also, at the same time, one of the first, if not the first, proto-metal band. All right, now, songs like Strychnine, you listen to it. The first time I heard it, years and years ago, I was like, that's the New York Dolls before the New York Dolls. And of course, the New York Dolls are a proto-punk band. But the New York Dolls, so the Sonics influenced the New York Dolls. The New York Dolls go on to influence Kiss, among other bands. And Kiss, not a punk band, hard rockin' band, at least in their early years, right? First album through and including Love Gun, give or take, right? And Kiss has gone on to inspire so many metal acts. So the makeup, the music, you name it. So that's part of my argument. But the selling point, or part of the selling point, is songs like The Witch and He's Waiting, which are definitely more allied with proto-metal than proto-punk. Give them a listen if you have a chance. And essentially, bands like the Sonics, like the MC5, who began in 1963, influenced the Sonics as well. Both of these bands, the Sonics and the MC5, influence and foreshadow punk, metal, and grunge. So I'm definitely including the Sonics as a proto-metal band that is definitely essential and one of the most important in my top 15 most important proto-metal bands of all time. Now, the rest is not so much chronological, but just pointing out important bands. The next is Vanilla Fudge, 1967, their first album, very psychedelic. We all know that psychedelic music, including bands like the Moody Blues, birthed prog rock. Think Procol Harum as well. But Vanilla Fudge, definitely in the game, along with those two bands, in furthering the cause or the creativity of heavy metal music. Definitely proto-metal. You have the wonderful Mark Stein on organ and keys, which, contemporaries with John Lord and other keyboardist, organist that I'm going to mention today. So psychedelic with tinges of hard rock, that heavy organ sound, and great drumming from Appice or Appice, however you pronounce his last name, Carmine, right? Just great. And a legacy drummer, of course, his brother Vinny comes in, played with Black Sabbath, Blue Murder, etc. Or is it Carmine himself? Anyway, I forget. But you get my point. Vanilla Fudge, 1967. That first album, mostly, if not all, cover songs, but they take R&B staples and other rock staples and make them their own, because of part of what is that heavy vibe that they give. It's not over the top heavy, but you definitely hear the beginnings of the sound that is growing and in its embryonic stage. All right, next is Blue Cheer, Vincebus Eruptum, the debut album, 1968. Again, very psychedelic, especially their second album, but the first album, psychedelic with blues rock coupled together. Acid rock, it's been described as. Again, like the two bands have already, like the Sonics, foreshadowing punk, and this time around foreshadowing doom and stoner rock / metal, and also like the Sonics foreshadowing grunge because of that use of heavy distortion, right? All right. Next is Iron Butterfly, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, and to some degree their debut album, 1968. You have the 17-minute wonderful title track, very psychedelic, very moody, very trippy, acid rock. You got some heavy, the da-na-na-na. That's pretty heavy of its day. Very influential on so many bands to follow. And of course, Doug Ingles' organ, a contemporary of Mark Stein and others that will follow, and you know who they are. Some big bands and big names to come up today. Now, what's interesting, a sidebar or anecdote here is 7th or 8th grade and 9th grade, my friends in high school and in grammar school, grammar school, we'd always talk about, have you bought that Iron Maiden album yet? A lot of us thought that like so many bands, like Jefferson Airplane becomes Jefferson Starship, we always thought, for whatever reason, that Iron Maiden had just changed their name from Iron Butterfly, moving with the times, because the album covers are heavy looking, and of course, different band. But anyway, so Iron Butterfly, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, 1968. Next is Steppenwolf, Canada's own Steppenwolf. The debut, also 1968, more psychedelic music, but tinged with blues and acid rock. Definitely some hard rock. And you have, of course, the first saying, perhaps, of the phrase heavy metal because of the motorcycle reference, Heavy Metal Thunder, and everything's, history made, right, is what I mean. You have songs like The Pusher, of course, and of course, Goldie McJohn on his Hammond organ, piano, and electric piano, also contemporary with Mark Stein and Doug Ingles. Wonderful keyboard and organ stylings, and that's so influential on two bands that I'm going to talk about. Again, you know who they are, they're coming. So yeah, I definitely think Steppenwolf, even albums later on like Steppenwolf 7 with the skulls on it, has a very hard rock metal grit to it in some ways. Is an overall vibe there. So yeah, definitely Steppenwolf there. The organ on Born to Be Wild in and of itself has a very Vanilla Fudge, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, all of Iron Butterfly feel to it. It was very that was the order of the day, to some degree, even Procol Harum, right? So Steppenwolf, definitely have to include them as a proto-metal band. Next is Cream, Wheels of Fire, 1968. Not their debut, but this is really where I think the proto-metal shtick comes in with this band. Of course, Clapton with his crunchy blues stylings, that very slow bluesy stuff that I think inspired Alex Lifeson on the debut of Rush, and definitely the guitar solo on By Torn the Snow Dog. So heavy and yet so bluesy and acidic at the same time. So groovy. It's a wonder. The guitars and the riffs are invigorating from Clapton and heavy for its day. especially live, and that's the selling point here. You have also wonderful bass from Jack Bruce and wonderful heavy drums from Ginger Baker. Jam rock, especially live. Heavier pieces live, extended pieces, hence the jam phrase. Examples: Crossroads live on the Wheels of Fire live part of that release. So yeah, and that's a sticking point with some of the bands here, is that it's where they play live that is where the proto-metal part really gels. It's in the studio stuff as well, but you really hear it in the live recordings. Next, of course, is Jimi Hendrix, or the Jimi Hendrix Experience. We could cite all of his 3 albums as very proto-metal, even the debut, but Electric Ladyland has 3 selling points, 1968, with Voodoo Child, All Along the Watchtower, and Voodoo Child, Slight Return. These are just phenomenally in many ways guitar-driven. There's just and of course it's bluesy rock, very, very akin to what early Zeppelin is doing, and Cream, and it's just so influential on so many people, including Judas Priest. In his biography, Heavy Duty, K.K. Downing talks about how Quatermass and Jimi Hendrix were so influential on his wanting to play guitar. And so definitely Jimi Hendrix, proto-metal. Next is MC5. I talked about them briefly in retrospective with the Sonics. Kick Out the Jams comes out in 1969. Very bold to put out your first album put out a live album as your first album, but they began in 1963. And of course, the song itself, Kick Out the Jams, a anthem for both punk and heavier music and proto-metal. And I'm not the first person to argue and make a case for MC5 as a proto-metal band. There are a lot of there's a few bands out there that are great for bringing the punks and the metalheads together. The MC5 are one of them. Nirvana's one of them. Definitely Motorhead. Early Iron Maiden with Paul Di'Anno on vocals. I could go on, but I won't. But definitely Kick Out the Jams. The whole album, and definitely that song, is an anthem for proto-punk and proto-metal and punk and metal all around. This is a crucial album. You have acid rock here that is segueing into heavy metal waters. It's again foreshadowing the punk and metal scene. The speed, the energy, and the nonconformity all go hand in hand with proto-metal and, of course, punk, as I said. All right, next, Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin 1, Led Zeppelin 2, the whole story of wanting to do light and shade, bouncing back and forth. We have the Pixies later, which inspires Nirvana to do the light and shade. But that's just the reverse of what Zeppelin did. I've talked about this before. Zeppelin starts off soft and heavy with songs like Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You. And then later on, they do things like Stairway to Heaven, where the first part of the song is all light and the second half is all shade, the heavier stuff, right? That gradual. Judas Priest goes on to do that with songs like Beyond the Realms of Death, where it's bouncing back between light and heavy. And then songs like Dreamer, Deceiver, Deceiver, where it's the first part is light, the second part is heavy. You can make the argument that Judas Priest has some proto-metal stuff with their first album, Rock'n'Rolla, and Sad Wings of Destiny, but they don't make the list here today. But you definitely could call those first 2 albums proto-metal. It's really with Sin After Sin and Stained Class where they're really getting into they are metal albums, especially Stained Class. Anyway, back to Led Zeppelin 1 and 2, light and shade, heavy blues taken from the greats like Willie Dixon, Muddy Waters. The list goes on, and then making it their own and making it fresh and new. Think of Vanilla Fudge, the name there, right? If we go back to them for a minute, because it was essentially someone inspired them to change the name from the Pigeons, I think, a horrible name for a band, because white boys doing blues kind of thing. So hence the word vanilla, and then you get the wonderful inspirational name to inspire other bands to do the oxymoronic name: Vanilla Fudge, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, Iron Butterfly. The list goes on, Iron Maiden, the list goes on and on. So that's part of the whole proto-metal thing in a way as well. So Led Zeppelin 1 and 2 both come out in 1969, one in January, Zeppelin 2 in October of 69, and you got some heavy blues, you got some wonderful gritty vocals from Plant, a male Janis Joplin in some ways. I'm not the first to say that. A wonderful bluesy guitarist, a great rhythm section that's just pummeling and crushing at times, and yet so miraculously, that's not a good word, so sonically soft at other times and angelic, and just with the acoustic beautiful pieces like Tangerine and Going to California. So definitely, but those aren't very metal at all. But stuff like Immigrant Song, right, Heartbreaker, Dazed and Confused, Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, the list goes on and on. Achilles' Last Stand, Down the Road, you know it. All right, next is Deep Purple. If we start with the first album, Shades of Deep Purple, we have hints of heavy metal because of the song Mandrake Root, which is on Shades of Deep Purple, 1968. And like Cream, and like some of the bands here, it's the live stuff, especially in the Ian Gillan era, the Mark II, where Ian Gillan is fronting Mandrake Root, and he's singing Rod Evans' lyrics, or the band's lyrics in the Rod Evans period. And then, even though he's not singing, he's playing tambourine and still being a front man, but no vocals, on Ring That Neck, also an instrumental from 1968. This is on the second album, Book of Taliesin. And so, yeah, this is the beginning. Very Vanilla Fudge, like definitely inspired by Vanilla Fudge contemporaries as well. Gillan's voice, very metal. If you know the story about how Ritchie Blackmore eventually fires Rod Evans because he hears Led Zeppelin. He's like, I want to do that. He went after Plant, couldn't get him, thank goodness. But he gets the wonderful Ian Gillan because he wanted to compete with Led Zeppelin, and boy, did they. And Gillan's voice is unique. It's wonderful. And then you have the wonderful John Lord on organ. And again, rivaling that of Mark Stein of Vanilla Fudge. Rivaling that of Doug Ingles' organ on Iron Butterfly stuff, and Goldie McJohn with Steppenwolf. Very similar and yet unique at the same time. Got the wonderful Blackmore, classically trained, a whole different animal from Page's blues-based notion of what guitar should be. And you have a kick-ass rhythm section with Pace and Glover. Definitely proto-metal with songs like Highway Star. The whole In Rock album itself is proto-metal to the core, with songs like Speed King, Child in Time, and Bloodsucker, definitely. The whole album, really. And Black Knight, of course. So definitely proto-metal. Really get going with proto-metal. Much more proto-metal with the In Rock album. June 1970. Next is Uriah Heep. Very heavy, very humble. 1970. This band is not wanting to do a traditional blues. They want to do something a bit more progressive. You have songs like Gypsy, which are stretched out. Not as stretched as, say, Child in Time by Purple, but they go on to do something similar to that with July Morning on their third album, and which has more of a slide guitar, heavy blues kind of thing, but still very proto-metal, and definitely some proto-metal stuff on the guitar that you hear on Demons and Wizards, and definitely Magician's Birthday. That guitar solo on that title track is just metal to the core. You got some metal stuff with All My Life, the way that Byron sings in that high register on the Demons and Wizards album. The Hammond organ from Ken Hensley throughout his stay in the band. Definitely proto-metal, again, rivaling that of Stein and Ingle and McJohn and Lord, but unique. Okay. Back to Gypsy. Gypsy is just a treasure. It's progressive, and yet it's heavy. It's definitely a proto-metal song. The whole album the debut album from Uriah Heep, so much foreshadows much to come in the heavy metal history that we have attached ourselves to. The crunchy guitar, the continuation of the heavy organ, the Hammond organ, as I said, from the brilliant Ken Hensley, rivaling again that of John Lord and others. A blend of hard rock, prog rock, heavy metal, still in its infancy. Okay, and again, we hear this again on Salisbury. You have the whole side 2, which is prog rock to the core, but yet heavy in its own right, but unique to itself. They never did the likes of that again. And then you have the folk and the hard stuff on side 1. All right, next is Grand Funk or Grand Funk Railroad, 1969, On Time, songs like TNUC and Into the Sun, and then the live version of Inside Looking Out. The whole live album, just called live album, their first live album, like Cream and like some of the other bands that I mentioned, it's really in performing live where they have that proto-metal sound. It's that energy, right? Just a great band all around. And let's say, and let's not forget, rather, they were on top of the world at one point, selling out. And then, of course, Led Zeppelin comes in and puts them to shame to some regard. All right, next is Humble Pie. Now, if you listen to their 2 first albums, As Safe as Yesterday is, 1969, and Rock and Town and Country that follows, and then their 3rd album just called Humble Pie, you hear a little bit of proto-metal, not much. But again, like Grand Funk and like Cream and others that I mentioned, it's really their live set that is that proto-metal where you have this over-the-top energy. And of course, I'm talking about Rockin' the Fillmore, 1971, live, all covers but one, and boy, does it rock. You have these long, really long songs. You have a 24-minute song, you have a 17-minute song, you have a 10-minute song, and of course, it culminates with the Ray Charles cover of Don't Need No Doctor, and Steve Marriott's voice is just metal on this album. It's so metal. It's not funny. All right. Next is Rainbow. Rainbow Rising. Some will call this a heavy metal album. I have to call it a proto-metal album. It has its metal moments with heavy songs like oh God, now I can't remember the name. Hold on, hold that thought. Sorry, folks, a little bit of a brain bubble there. So yeah, the song I'm trying to think of is A Light in the Black. That is a heavy, heavy song. That is proto-metal to the core. Run with the Wolf to some degree as well. Even though it's a love song, Do You Close Your Eyes has a heavy proto-metal shtick to it. And then you have that progressive stuff with Starstruck and Stargazer, especially Stargazer, that has a Kashmir feel to it. I think the song was inspired by Kashmir. And Terra Woman has some prog elements to it in the introduction. So that quasi-heavy or psychedelic, inspired by some of the bands I mentioned earlier, like Vanilla Fudge, perhaps, and Iron Butterfly, and Zeppelin. And of course, Dio's voice is definitely later becomes metal. And here it's definitely metal and or proto-metal. So Rainbow Rising, definitely. And that's 1976. And of course, the big name is Black Sabbath. I saved the best for last in the sense that this is the most recognized proto-metal band, or rather, the debut is the most recognized proto-metal debut of all time is Black Sabbath, 1970. And I've said this before on this channel that this album, this debut album from Black Sabbath, is both proto-metal and heavy metal at the same time. I know it's a paradox. See if you can wrap your brain around that. But yeah, I mean, you have 2 suites on this album, these extended pieces, which, you have NIB, which also has 3 songs in front of it, basically, and, Wasp, and if I'm getting, and then at the end you have Warning, Sleeping Village, and something else. I don't have the album in front of me. But when you do these extended pieces, it makes you hark back to things like Iron Butterflies, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, the long stretch things that Vanilla Fudge did live, and even Steppenwolf to some degree. And all these bands here are known to stretch their material live for the most part, especially Cream, I would say, but in Humble Pie, probably all of them really. And I think that is part of what it means to be a heavy metal band, at least in the early stages where you have these long extended pieces or suites. And it doesn't have to be 20 minutes, but 8 minutes itself is long for the order of the times, or the order of the day during these times. So I think Black Sabbath is the king of proto-metal and in the originators of heavy metal. So if you know Martin Popoff, the wonderful critic, you know that he's written a book about where did heavy metal begin, and the album cover gives it away because the book cover gives it away because it has the album cover from Black Sabbath on there. And so he cites some classical composers, Paganini, as possibly heavy metal, and I like that idea. But here, in all seriousness, Black Sabbath, 1970, you have a bit of finger, you have this wonderful bass tone, you have the tritone, and you have the song itself, Black Sabbath, is definitely heavy metal, if not proto-metal, because of the subject matter, inspiring Iron Maiden's, perhaps The Number of the Beast, dealing with, your next online for the human sacrifice, to quote George Carlin once again. But what a wonderful album. All these bands are phenomenal in their own right. Let me just recap. The Sonics, Vanilla Fudge, Blue Cheer, Iron Butterfly, Steppenwolf, Cream, Jimi Hendrix, MC5, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, Grand Funk Railroad, Humble Pie, Rainbow, and finally Black Sabbath. Tell me what you think about my list. Take care. God bless. Bye now.